sitting with Dr. Robert Veatch, who is one of the most eminent thinkers, writers, teachers, and general leaders of the entire bioethics field from its very inception. Thank you, Dr. Veatch, for sitting down with me.
It's a pleasure.
As someone who, again, was there and is one of the founders and fathers of the bioethics field, I'd like to begin by hearing a bit about your background, your childhood, your family of origin, your early years, please.
Born in New York, raised in the suburbs of Chicago where my father was a pharmacist. I had two real interests early on. One was religion and ethics, the other was medicine. But I knew I didn't want to combine them by being, say, a medical missionary or something like that. I actually first came up with the idea that I would do basic science research on the physiology of ethical thoughts. What is it in your brain that makes you think that abortion is immoral or something else is morally required of you? I knew that that was not something that would be easily researched, so I chose to look at the pharmacology of narcotics, morphine, and its analogs on the grounds that narcotics obviously produce a predictable physiological response in the human, but they also produce what I refer to as an I like that experience that's very cross-cultural. It seems to suggest that the value experience of liking something has a clear biological foundation. So that was my strategy. I kept asking questions that my lab animals wouldn't answer for me. So I took a leave of absence from the pharmacology department at the University of California Medical Center, went to Harvard for what I thought was going to be a year of study of ethics and philosophy and religion. That turned into a 3-year degree and then an application to do a doctorate there. So I was at Harvard for a total of 6 years getting my education. And it was about that time in the mid-1960s that I discovered that there was another way of combining interests in ethics and medicine, and that was to study medical ethics. There really wasn't such a field, nothing called bioethics, but I hit on the ethics of medicine as a way of pursuing these combined interests. When I applied to the doctoral program at Harvard, I applied in a program that essentially lets you study applied ethics. You could study the ethics of blank and you fill in the blank. So lots of people in the 1960s were studying the ethics of war, the ethics of race relations, and I decided that I would propose the study of the ethics of medicine. John Fletcher, who was at Columbia Union Seminary at the time, ended up doing a dissertation on issues in genetics at just about the same time. So the two of us, I think, were the ones that began work in formal doctoral level studies of the ethics of medicine. I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, which is where the campus of Northwestern University and Garrett are located. I never attended anything at Garrett, but through grade school and high school, all of my friends were the sons and daughters of Garrett faculty. So I got oriented to an interest in ethics almost certainly by the influence of Northwestern University faculty, and particularly Garrett faculty. Garrett was known at the time as one of the more left-oriented social justice focused seminaries. And I'm sure that accounted for the development of my interest in the ethics of war. I've always been a pacifist. I've had deep commitment to the civil rights movement, and I'm sure that orientation developed from my friends and their parents who were faculty at Northwestern. Art Dyke and especially Ralph Potter were my mentors for my doctoral dissertation. The program I was in was very eclectic. So in addition to Ralph and Art, who had appointments both in the Divinity School and the School of Public Health, we also took courses in sociology, where I worked with Renee Fox. She was on my doctoral exam committee, Talcott Parsons, but also in the philosophy department, where the strongest influence on me was John Rawls. I took courses from Rawls, and that surely oriented me to the academic study of questions of justice. John Rawls is famous, some would say the most important philosopher of the 20th century, famous for one book called Theory of Justice, where at great length he worked out a theory that incorporates two principles that he considers the principles of justice. The first being a commitment to equal liberty, the second being a commitment to distribution such that, in Rawls's perspective, any inequalities have to be justified by serving the interests of the least well-off group. Now, one of the issues that arose in Rawlsian theory is exactly where you apply the theory. He was always committed to the notion that it dealt with the establishment of basic social practices. Almost certainly he would have objected to taking his theory to the bedside or to an IRB meeting and deciding how to handle subjects of human research at the concrete level. It was a theory of basic practices. Rawls resisted applying his theory to areas like healthcare, but some of his students, particularly Norman Daniels, Henry Richardson here at Georgetown, and to some extent, I worked on the question of what would it look like if a Rawlsian theory of justice were applied to healthcare. That led to the writing of a book of mine entitled The Foundations of Justice, where I teased out particularly problems of utility maximizing in healthcare. Yes, I've actually spent a lot of time researching the history of medical ethics and the emergence of bioethics. The thesis of that book was that medical ethics, or what we now talk about as bioethics, has its rich periods of growth when physicians and scientists are in dialogue with humanists, philosophers, theologians, social scientists. The book, in fact, is titled Disrupted Dialogue. The thesis was, in the 1770s, particularly in Scotland, there was this huge breakthrough in medical ethics because the professor of medicine at the University of Edinburgh was very serious about ethics and actually incorporated some lectures on ethics into his courses that later became the book that became the basis for medical ethics in the modern English-speaking world. Soon after that, by the next generation, medicine was becoming specialized from the Enlightenment period, and science the questions in science became so unique and specialized that a person could easily spend his entire lifetime on one very narrow question. One of the professors at the University of Edinburgh works on the structure of the eye, for example. So the interest in ethics among physicians, in my view, deteriorated and didn't emerge again until the middle of the 20th century. Now, there was some preliminary events around the middle of the century, like the Nuremberg trials and our experience with Nazi research, the writing of the Declaration of Geneva and so forth, that are precursors to the emergence of medical ethics. But in my view, it was the 1960s that really triggered the rich development and the renewal of the conversation between humanists on the one side, physicians and scientists on the other side. My claim is that this was directly the result of the wonderful radical social movements of the 1960s. In the United States, that meant the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, but there was a rich women's movement at the time that all of these had the structure of being concerned about human rights, and particularly the rights of lower status individuals, whether it be blacks in the civil rights movement, ordinary people in the anti-war movement, the Vietnam War movement, women who were of lower social status. All of these, there was also a students' rights movement at the time. All of them had this model of a relationship between a high-powered elite, generals in the army, for example, and lower status individuals. And my real interest was in the rights of lower status individuals. And I took all of those interests in the anti-war movement, civil rights movement, and transferred them rather directly into the field of medicine, which, if you follow through the analogy, leads to a patients' rights movement, the corollary of which was the identification of the role of the elites, the experts, if you like, and what they are experts on. And the claim in the anti-war movement the slogan was, "War's too important to be left to the generals." Or to put it in slightly more concrete terms, being an expert on carrying out a war doesn't mean you're an expert on the ethics of war. That led to my doctoral dissertation focusing on the relation between expertise on facts on the one hand and expertise on values on the other hand. And in medicine, from my perspective at least, that's the critical issue. In research medicine, for instance, researchers are surely experts on the science of medicine, how to design a research question, statistical tests, that sort of thing. But I would claim that they are in no way special experts on questions like the rights of a subject in a research project. Or in clinical medicine, the clinician is in no way an expert on the rights of a patient.
There was a series in the New England Journal about curing versus caring, as though in many physicians and researchers as well, it's a dichotomy. And there was a notion that if you had to choose a physician who was a curer or a carer, which would you choose? And I wonder whether you think that's a false dichotomy, or if you could talk a bit about why it is that the empathy, the compassion, and the rights orientation is often considered oxymoronic in the training of physicians and researchers.
The distinction was an important one, but I take it to illustrate the main thesis of all my work throughout my career, and that is that the choice among options, whether you're focused on curing or on caring, for example, is a choice that should not be left to the experts. It's not up to physicians or research scientists to make those kinds of choices. Now, I actually am inclined to give it a kind of political twist. Although it sounds outrageous, I believe it's very important for a patient to understand his or her physician's political and value orientation. I actually tested that in the writing of my doctoral dissertation, where I looked at the role of the physician in communicating birth control information. I wrote in the 1960s, birth control was the big topic, and what I pressed was the relationship between being an expert on the facts of birth control and being an expert on the values related to birth control. And my thesis was that physicians are surely experts on the science of birth control. One of the kinds of questions I would ask a doctor was, "Doctor, does the pill cause cancer?" And at the time, still today in a way, there's a lot of controversy about that question. I intentionally asked the questions of the doctors I interviewed the way a layperson would have to ask the question. So I didn't ask the question very precisely. I asked the general, almost naive question, "Doctor, does the pill cause cancer?" What I was interested in was the relationship of the doctor's answer to that question, which almost anybody would see as a kind of scientific question requiring answers from medical science. The relationship of the answers to that question to the values and beliefs that the doctor held. And I did this by asking physicians a bunch of these questions that anybody would interpret as science questions. How likely are you to get pregnant if you skip a pill mid-cycle, for example, was the kind of question I would ask. Then I also asked a bunch of what I called value questions. Doctor, is the birth control immoral? Does it violate natural law? Does it lead to promiscuity? Questions of this sort. Essentially asking, what are your values about birth control? Now, the hidden agenda that, quite frankly, I didn't acknowledge to the physicians I was interviewing, probably would raise questions about that today, but my hidden agenda was to look at the correlation between the physician's value judgments about birth control and the physician's answers about the science. What I found was that if the birth control pill was moral, it didn't cause cancer. And if the birth control pill was immoral, the answer was it caused cancer. Now, the intriguing thing about this was all the physicians who answered the question were answering accurately in their own minds, and they could actually cite studies that would support their views. For example, the physician who thought the pill could cause cancer, the physician who thought the pill was immoral, when I pressed him on what he thought about it causing cancer, the physician would say something like, "There's studies of precarcinogenic cell changes in the breasts of beagles. Would you want your daughter taking a pill that does something like that?" Now, they had reference to real studies. Turns out lots of chemicals cause precarcinogenic cell changes in the breasts of beagles, but they had real data in mind. If I ask the pro-birth control physician, he'd say, not a shred of evidence the pill has ever caused cancer in a human being, which was also scientifically correct. So I was intrigued by how the value orientation of the physician would filter the data set that they used in answering the patient's question on something like, does the pill cause cancer? And what I wanted to claim was, surely the physician is an expert on the science, but surely he's not mainly male physicians at the time. Surely he's not an expert on the ethical question, is the birth control pill immoral? And yet we demonstrate that the values and beliefs about birth control were influencing the way the doctor communicated what everybody would take to be questions of scientific fact. One of the great virtues of a good university is you make contact with lots of faculty who are on the cutting edge. And it turns out that both Ralph Potter and Art Dyke and several other faculty I was working with at Harvard, Don Warwick and Herb Kelman in the social relations department, were all in conversation with a fellow named Dan Callahan, who turned out to be a philosopher, done his doctoral work at Harvard, who was developing an interest in forming an institute, originally called the Institute of Society, Ethics, and the Life Sciences. We finally figured out that that was too long a name and too confusing a name, so everybody was calling it the Hastings Center. Finally, they changed the name to the Hastings Center. All of my mentors at Harvard were tied in to the emergence of the Hastings Center. 1969 was when it was founded. By 1970, I was wrapping up my doctoral dissertation, planning on going into the job market, and I conveyed to my mentors, I really didn't want a straight philosophy or religious ethics teaching job. If that's what it had to be, that would be all right with me. But I was really interested in something more innovative, something more interdisciplinary, and not necessarily in a university. I quickly learned about the plans afoot to develop this research institute that became known as the Hastings Center. My mentors introduced me to Dan Callahan. I interviewed for the position of the junior staff member and actually joined up with the Institute literally on the day when the Institute first opened its formal offices. They'd been going for a while, running the Hastings Center out of the homes of Dan Callahan and Will Galen, who were the two key people in the founding of the Hastings Center. September 1st, 1970 was my first day at work, and that was the day that the lease began for the offices of the Hastings Center. I was the first one to show up that morning. I literally got the key from the landlord and opened the door to the offices of the Hastings Center. I'm very proud of that fact, that I was the one that opened the door, so to speak. That's not exactly accurate because they'd been working for a year and a half or more, developing the research projects that were going on there. But I became the first junior staff person.
And as I have read, there were 4 major research groups in those early years: death and dying, genetics, behavior control, and population. And I'd like to hear you share whatever you'd like about those 4 groups, but I'd particularly like to hear you talk a little bit about the tension between paternalism and autonomy that manifested itself most clearly in the death and dying research group.
Yes. The Hastings Center is an interdisciplinary organization. The backbone of it, especially in the early years, was a group of fellows, about 70 fellows in the early years, more than that now. These are people who have full-time jobs, usually in a university or in a government agency, something like that. And they would come together for meetings from time to time. And the mode of doing the interdisciplinary research was the forming of these 4 research groups. So 10, 15, as many as 20 of the fellows would join up with a research group and get together. It became a very lively and fruitful interaction across disciplines, but also across geographical boundaries. People from especially all over the United States, but some from outside the United States would get together. To take the death and dying group as an example, Will Gale and Dan Callahan and I kind of divided up labor for administering these 4 groups, and my particular job was to administer the death and dying group in the earliest phase. There was a while when we got another staff person, Mark LePay, and he ran it for a while, and then after he left, I took it back over again. The death and dying research group included many of the key players in the important development of the definition of death debate. It included Henry Beecher, who was the chair of the Harvard Ad Hoc Committee, included Ralph Potter, but also included 2 brothers, the Sadlers, who were the writers of the original Model Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, and it included Paul Ramsey, the chairman of the religion department at Princeton, and Hans Jonas, a philosopher in the New School for Social Research, who were the most vocal skeptics about brain death. They weren't militantly opposed to it, but they had many, many questions about it. So from the point of view of a young academic who's just finished his dissertation, being the administrator of this wonderful group of people from different disciplines with different points of view is a wonderful education. It's just, you couldn't imagine a better first job for somebody who's just finished a doctorate. The first issue we took up, appropriately enough, was the definition of death. The group was chaired by Alex Capron, a lawyer who you know well, and Leon Cass, a scientist who really was a philosopher, a student of Greek philosophy. And they were the leaders that produced the Hastings Center research on the definition of death. That produced a law review article, technically authored by Alex Capron and Leon Cass, but it was the product of this entire research group. There was also a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association that raises questions about definition of death. And my orientation was always on the fact-value dichotomy that I thought was perfectly illustrated in the definition of death debate. The Hastings Center had as its main focus these 4 research groups. Later there was a 5th on health policy. But it also had other kinds of activities to contribute to the development of ethics in the life sciences. It early on developed a journal called the Hastings Center Report, which has become, some would claim, the premier journal generally in biomedical ethics. So we had a publishing effort with the Hastings Center Report. It was obvious that one of the major topics in bioethics was the protection of human subjects in biomedical research. And early on, we saw the emergence of research ethics committees. They weren't called IRBs yet, but there were committees around that monitored and helped protect human subjects. I actually chaired a tiny IRB at the Hastings Center whenever we would do a small piece of empirical work, which wasn't often. But I was also a member of the Montefiore Hospital IRB as the so-called public member. And so I was oriented to the work of these human subjects committees and realized that many of the members were at best tangential to the field of biomedical ethics. They tended to be people who were appointed by department chairmen to join a committee. If you'd been on the admissions committee and you'd been on some other committee, you'd get an assignment to go onto the human subjects committee at Montefiore. And the people would arrive at the meeting with no background, no orientation to the field. Now, Primer eventually steps into that huge gulf. But at the Hastings Center, I, in talking with other members of the staff, thought it would be nice to do a little newsletter. Talked to Dan Callahan about it, talked to Carol Levine, who was the managing editor of the Hastings Center Report, and at a meeting of some sort, a physician from Yale, who's a serious student of biomedical ethics, and I believe he'd probably already been working in a kind of staff capacity with the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, a very long-named committee. A fellow named Bob Levine. And we were chatting, and he mentioned that he thought a newsletter would be useful for ethics committee members, research ethics committee members. I conveyed that I'd been thinking exactly the same thing, and we came up with a model that the Hastings Center would be the institutional sponsor of a newsletter called IRB, that Bob Levine would be the editor, and there was originally 4 associate editors, and I had other things going on, including the work with the Death and Dying group, and later the Ethics and Health Policy group. So I said I couldn't play a major role in it, but I'd be happy to be an associate editor. That was the origin of the IRB newsletter, which is still published to this day.
Around the same time, Peter Buxton, one of the physicians in the Public Health Service, alerted Jean Heller, a reporter, to the existence of the United States Public Health Service study of syphilis in the Negro male, and it was in fact exposed. And I'd like you to describe how you first became aware of that study, what your reaction was to that news, and what, if anything, or how it in fact affected your work during that period of 72 and beyond.
Well, I can't remember when I first heard of the study. Presumably, I read it in the New York Times or something, some public press. I was not a player in the development of the critique of the study, but obviously got very interested in it. It had all of the issues of civil rights, human rights, the interest in the oppressed as a research subject and so forth. I had actually written kind of an expose of a little study that in some ways was similar to the Tuskegee syphilis study. It was a study of birth control, which was already on my agenda. A researcher wanted to find out if the reported side effects of the birth control pill were psychological figments of women's imagination, or they were really physiologically caused. And being a good scientist, he knew exactly how to do that research. He did a randomized controlled trial where he gave half of his women subjects, who happened to be primarily low-income Hispanic American women in Texas, gave half of them real birth control pills, and the other half he gave placebos. And he wanted to see if there was a difference between the two groups in their reporting of side effects. His hypothesis really was that the women getting the placebo would start reporting headaches and nausea and all of the things that hysterical women might report seemed to be the stereotype in the study. What he proved was that birth control pills prevent pregnancy. The women in the placebo group tended to get pregnant, and there were a number of pregnancies. I heard about the study, wrote a short piece for the Hastings Center report about it, all of which is to say I was oriented to human subjects research and ethical problems that can emerge in the abuse of low-income minority subjects. So when I heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study, my ears perked up. I was quite interested, and I followed it rather closely. One of the outcomes of that expose was legislation that eventually gives rise to the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects. That was the concern of Senator Edward Kennedy, who was the chair of a Senate subcommittee in the area at the time, and he wanted to have hearings on the study and related problems. He needed some help in planning the hearings, and he contacted Dan Callahan at the Hastings Center because he knew this was a center that did work in this area. Dan Callahan sort of passed it off to me, and I was invited to go to Washington to work with Ted Kennedy's staff in the planning of the hearings that were eventually going to give rise to the legislation that established the National Commission and give rise to the kind of formalization of institutional review boards. I worked with the staff. I knew about Henry Beecher, of course, was by now a friend of mine, a mentor of mine. He was one of my mentors at Harvard, and then he was on the Death and Dying Committee at Hastings. And I knew he'd published an absolutely remarkable study in 1966 where he simply presented the research methodologies of 22 studies, the implication of which was, how could you possibly be doing this to human subjects? So I had a model, and I actually extended Henry Beecher's work came up with a new list of protocols, including that birth control study that I referred to. And it conveyed all of this to Ted Kennedy's staff, helped plan out who the expert witnesses were going to be, and found myself on the list of witnesses giving testimony in the committee hearings, where I basically summarized studies between 1966 and I guess was 1973, the message of which was there's still substantial questions about research methods and the rights of subjects that look like they're not being protected. My extension study was eventually published as well. But that got me directly tied into the Senate subcommittee hearings that were all triggered by the Tuskegee syphilis study. The National Commission was this wonderful collection of various kinds of experts. I was struck by the fact that the legal mandate for the committee actually required a substantial presence of non-scientists. Essentially, half of the commission were non-scientists, philosophers, ethicists, lawyers, people with an interest in human subjects protection, but not from the point of view of being research scientists. They met over the course of several years. In order to do sustained work, they commissioned a lot of consultants to write papers on some of the key issues. Obviously, one of the major issues was consent in human subjects research, and I was commissioned to write one of the studies on the concept of informed consent. I traced the tensions in various strands of the history of medical ethics. One remarkable fact that really we only belatedly discovered was if you take the Hippocratic Oath seriously, it requires the physician to work for the benefit of his patient or her patient according to the physician's ability and judgment. Logically, that means physicians are prohibited from doing any research with their patients, or for that matter, even with non-patients, if you define research as an enterprise designed to pursue generalizable knowledge and not to work for the benefit of the specific patient with whom the researcher might be providing care. So I emphasized the enormous challenge to traditional medical ethics that research medicine poses. I pointed out that classical utilitarianism gets you beyond the individual patient, but it has this enormous problem of justifying a behavior whenever the aggregate good outweighs the harm that is done, or at least when it maximizing aggregate net utility. The problem with that is one way you can maximize aggregate net utility is by doing potentially serious harms to one individual and justify it by the millions of people down the road who will eventually benefit. That's, if you like, a ready-made justification for the Nazi research, and we surely wanted to avoid any system of ethics that would imply a toleration of Nazi medical research. The alternative was to turn to the notion of human rights, to the rights of individuals and the duties of others interacting with those individuals. And I suggested in my background paper that informed consent really has its foundation in this duty-based approach to medical ethics. It would justify certain activities of medical researchers that aren't designed specifically for the benefit of the patient, but it would be held in check by certain duty-based moral insights, the most obvious of which was an adequately informed consent by the subject. I've often stressed that when I hear researchers say they're going to get fully informed consent, my antennae go up. I say the person really doesn't mean that, because fully informed consent would mean tell the subjects literally everything, and nobody in his right mind wants to know literally everything. So I use the phrase adequately informed consent, and I argue in the background paper for the National Commission that adequately informed consent, the requirement for adequately informed consent, has its foundation in this duty-based ethic that opens the door to research that may not benefit the individual subject, but it doesn't open the door to subordinating the rights and interests of an individual subject to the masses of humanity that one day may benefit from the research. One of the great lasting products of the National Commission was a small report, which is now referred to as the Belmont Report, that responds to a legislated mandate that went something like this commission should look at the principles of ethics that should govern human subjects research. I was not directly involved in the Belmont Report. My colleague here at the Kennedy Institute, Tom Beecham, was involved in the staff and played a central role in the writing of that report. The Belmont Report looks at basic principles of ethics and how they shape the judgments that guide human subjects protection. As a committee-produced document, there's some rough edges in the report. It's not an accident that the Belmont Report has principles that look very much like the principles that show up in the book of Tom Beecham and Jim Childress, The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. On the other hand, some might note that the Principles of Biomedical Ethics have 4 principles, while the Belmont Report has 3. And essentially that is a dispute over how you should handle the ethical principle of producing consequences. Tom Beecham, I think correctly, proposes 2 principles dealing with the maximizing of consequences. Beneficence, the maximizing of good consequences, and non-maleficence, the minimizing of harms. He insists to this day that they're 2 separate principles, and by treating them as 2 separate principles, we have a language that permits us to address questions that can't be addressed if we combine these 2 consequence maximizing principles into a single concept of utility maximizing. Utility maximizing requires that we have a theory of how we combine our estimates of the benefits and our estimate of the harms. And you really need the language of non-maleficence and beneficence to carry out a discussion about the proper way of combining benefits and harms. When I teach medical students, I teach here from time to time at Georgetown. I've taught medical students that are going into Albany Medical College for over 30 years, and I teach all the medical students at St. George's University in Grenada. taught probably 15,000 medical students in my day, and particularly large classes in Grenada. I have a whole section on the issue of different ways that we can combine benefit and harm, and how you get to different answers depending on your strategy for combining benefits and harms. I use an example of a hypothetical research question that compares a standard chemotherapy with an experimental 4-drug regimen. And it turns out if you hypothesize some pretty plausible estimates of benefit and harms in the two treatment arms, one way of combining benefits and harms leads you to the conclusion that the high-risk, high-gain research arm is utility maximizing. Another strategy leads you to the conclusion that the two arms with exactly the same data, the two arms are equally balanced. They're in equipoise, we would say, and therefore it's ethically justified to a randomized trial. There's a third way of combining benefits and harms that is summarized in the old slogan, primum non nocere, first of all, do no harm, that says your first duty is to minimize harms. And if that's your strategy, the standard treatment is morally required of you because it poses less threat of harm. So just by working with concepts of beneficence and non-maleficence, the two utility maximizing principles of the Beecham-Childress 4 principles, you end up with the conclusion you're morally obliged to give your patient the research arm, you're morally obliged to give your patient only the standard treatment, or you're in equipoise and therefore you can justify randomization. And all of that hinges on the discussion of your theory for combining benefits and harms. I think it's an intriguing problem. One of the flaws of the Belmont Report that it doesn't really give us the linguistic tools to carry on the discussion of the proper way of combining benefits and harms, the way the Beecham and Childress formulation would do it. I've always, in my own ethical theory, insisted that beneficence and non-maleficence are independent principles, and many include this idea that avoiding harm is a prior principle or a principle that you first must satisfy. That turns out to be a very conservative principle, one that if taken literally you would never do any research with, because you'd always stick with the tried and true rather than the experimental, where you'd have to concede because you don't know the answer, that's why it's an experiment. Doing something that's experimental poses extra threat of harm, and by maximizing or prioritizing non-maleficence, you have a duty not to do that harm. You're forced to do the very conservative standard treatment, not to be a researcher, I suppose.